Thank you for taking the time to watch this video today. My name is John Lambert and I'm the CEO of Amplia Therapeutics. And what I'd like to do today is talk to you a little bit about our plans for calendar year 2022, as well as the successes and things we've achieved during 2021. Firstly though, I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking to you about the technology and the drugs that we're developing, the diseases we're interested in, and why we think our drugs have an advantage over others. Amplia is developing inhibitors of a target called focal adhesion kinase, or FAK. And FAK is a key signaling molecule in a number of different biological pathways that support disease progression in diseases such as fibrosis of the liver and the lung, or in oncology indications where solid tumours may have a fibrotic element to them, in particular tumours such as pancreatic and ovarian cancers. FAK protects and supports the growth of tumours in a number of different ways. First of all, it helps lay down and provide a fibrotic or tough tissue capsule around some solid tumours, in particular pancreatic cancer tumours. It also plays a role to dampen down the immune response. So were the immune system be able to recognise tumours, it may be able to reject them. But unfortunately, FAK plays a role to suppress the immune response in the environment close to the tumour. Finally, FAK plays a role in metastasis, or the process whereby primary tumours fragment and seed secondary tumours in other parts of the body. And this is one of the most dangerous aspects of a number of solid tumour forms, in particular pancreatic cancer. So FAK plays a role in all these support processes that aid and abet the growth of the tumour in its solid form. And so what we would like to do is essentially remove this protective layer that FAK provides, so that chemotherapy drugs and the immune system can attack the tumour and hopefully either limit its growth or remove it. The indications that we're most interested in are pancreatic cancer and idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis. Pancreatic cancer is an incredibly dangerous and life-threatening form of cancer. 5-year survival rates for patients with pancreatic cancer are less than 10% on average. Compare that to some other solid tumours such as skin cancers and lung cancers, whose treatment now sees 5-year survival rates having risen to 70 or 80%. In the case of idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, this is not a form of cancer, but it's a form of progressive development of scarring in the lung tissues that gradually leads to the decline in lung function, which even with the best treatments available today, has a median survival rate of around 3 to 5 years. So these are two both very unmet needs, very important indications for new drugs to be developed in both of these areas. And in recognition of this, Amplia has asked the US FDA for orphan drug designation for its lead development candidate, AMP945, and we've received those orphan drug designations. And what that means is that down the track, FDA will provide us support and advice when it comes to developing these products as they move towards commercialization. Commercially, we're also working in very busy, interesting areas, in particular in fibrosis. There's a lot of deal-making activity going on at present as big pharma companies seek new development candidates to address these highly unmet needs in fibrotic illnesses. So what we're trying to do is advance Amplia's assets to the point at which we can initiate some of these discussions ourselves and engage with big pharma partners who may be interested in taking up licenses to our assets. Viewed as a pipeline diagram, it shows that AMP945, our lead development candidate, is about to enter phase 2 clinical trials in pancreatic cancer as a combination therapy. Later in the year, in 2022, we also expect to put AMP945 into a trial in pulmonary fibrosis patients. All the while, we're looking at the potential utility of AMP945 and its partner molecule, AMP886, in other indications. AMP886 is another FAK inhibitor, which is particularly interesting because of its unique biological activity profile, which we think may lend it to have therapeutic utility in other forms of cancer. So in 2022, we have some pretty audacious plans for growth in this company. First of all, it's our aim to recruit patients into 2 different phase 2 clinical trials of AMP945, one in pancreatic cancer and the other in pulmonary fibrosis. And if we achieve our goals, we expect to be able to report results from these trials, or at least early results from these trials, by the end of the calendar year. We also intend to expand our pipeline by progressing the other molecule, AMP886, into early development. And by doing this, we will continue to build momentum in the company. We'll continue to hit these corporate and development milestones, which will build value and momentum. And this is a status update on where we're at with our phase 2 clinical trial planning. For the pancreatic cancer trial, the protocol design work is now complete. And this clinical trial, the first stage of it, has been funded through a recent capital raise that we completed literally this week. The drug manufacture for that phase 2 clinical trial is nearing completion, and we expect to commence dosing of patients in that trial sometime during the first quarter of 2022. The pulmonary fibrosis trial is running somewhat behind pancreatic cancer. The design work for that trial is in an advanced stage. We've locked in vendors and the design and the schedules for some preliminary toxicology work that's required before we can initiate that trial. And recruitment in that trial, subject to the results of those toxicology studies, is due to commence in the second half of 2022. So putting all that on a timeline, you can see that patient recruitment for pancreatic cancer is slated to begin in the first quarter of the year. In mid-2023, we expect to be conducting an interim analysis of the data that's been collected in that trial so far. And by the third quarter of 2022, we'd also like to be recruiting patients into our pulmonary fibrosis trial. The reason we're confident about completing these or meeting these goals is that because we have a track record for achieving everything we've set out to do. Over the last 2.5 years, we've taken AMP945 from being a preclinical development candidate, as yet untested in the clinic, to having completed a phase 1 clinical trial that was incredibly successful and told us a lot about AMP945 and its pharmaceutical properties. Also during this year, we said, and we did, complete a lot of planning work for the pancreatic cancer trial. And that work has borne fruit, because what it's allowed us to do is design a trial that allows us to integrate first-line pancreatic cancer patients. This is quite rare for an early development oncology drug to be able to go into cancer patients who've been recently diagnosed. So we're very pleased to be able to plan to do that in the first quarter of this year. We've also produced new non-clinical data, preclinical data during the year that further supports our preclinical rationale for conducting these studies in pancreatic cancer and fibrosis patients. And finally, this year, we set out to raise the money required to run the pancreatic cancer trial, and we did so. So I'm very proud of the track record that we've got for delivery against the corporate goals that we've set out for ourselves. So I'd like to just spend a little bit of time taking you through some of these goals that we set at the beginning of the year and how we've achieved against them during 2021. We've expanded our human capital. In particular, we brought on new skills to our board by appointing Jane Bell as a director in April. Jane is a very experienced company director and has spent is a lawyer by training. We've also expanded our management team in order to allow us to build the capability that's required in order for us to conduct these complex drug development activities. We've built out our clinical advisory board, most notably quite recently by the addition of a gentleman called Jose Iglesias. Jose was one of the initial medical directors when Abraxane was approved for use in pancreatic cancer patients. So he has many years of experience in pancreatic cancer and running clinical studies in those, and he's now advising us on how best to execute against our plans. And recently, we also appointed a new Chief Financial Officer, Hamish George from Bio 101, who are based here in Melbourne. In terms of financial capital, over the year, we raised about $16.2 million. We did this in 2 rounds. First of all, we raised $3.8 million in May, and then we raised $12.4 million in December and November in order to support the pancreatic cancer trial. Over the course of this year, we've continued to build a base of institutional investors. And at the moment, our substantial institutional investors are Platinum Investment Management, Blue Flag Holdings, and Acorn Capital. We've also received around about $3 million in non-dilutive capital over the year, primarily through an R&D tax rebate and an R&D tax rebate loan from our local state government. So we're well set up to execute on our plans, both in terms of people and in terms of financial capital. So let's talk a little bit more about some of the clinical development milestones that we met this year. In May, we completed enrolment in our phase 1 study of AMP945 in healthy volunteers. That trial recruited 56 volunteers in the age range of 18 to 65, and it was conducted at a single site here in Melbourne. The summary of the outcomes is as follows. AMP945 was safe and well tolerated at all the doses we tested it at. In that trial, we were able to demonstrate that AMP945 in humans engages with the target FAC. So in other words, in these healthy volunteers, we could show that AMP945 inhibits FAC in human subjects. And that's a prerequisite for efficacy. If you're not hitting the target, then you can't expect to see your drug do anything in humans. So having seen that reassures us that when we go into patients, no matter what we see in terms of efficacy, at least we know we're hitting the target we intend to hit. There were no serious adverse events or withdrawals in the trial, and we were unable to identify any trends in the safety data. The pharmacokinetics and the pharmaceutic properties of AMP945 were excellent. We saw really nice dose proportional exposures, and there was apparently no food effect. AMP945 is given as a capsule by mouth, and it appears that we can do so once daily, which is pretty well ideal for an early development pharmaceutical product. In other work, we've also demonstrated that there's very little interaction and very little risk of interaction of AMP945 with other drugs that these pancreatic cancer and pulmonary fibrosis patients may be taking already. So why is this important, all this data from this phase 1 trial? Well, first of all, as I mentioned, inhibition of FAC in these skin biopsies that we collected from these healthy volunteers confirms that we're engaging the target that we intend to hit. AMP945 inhibits FAC in human volunteers. AMP945's safety profile is also important because we now know we can combine it relatively safely with other drugs that these patients in both pancreatic cancer and pulmonary fibrosis patients are taking. And also being able to administer AMP945 orally once daily augurs well for its development as a pharmaceutical product. On the research front, we've also achieved a number of outcomes. Early in the year, we showed that not only does AMP945 demonstrate efficacy in preclinical models of lung fibrosis, but it also demonstrates signs of efficacy in liver fibrosis. And this slide is showing AMP945 and AMP886 hitting a number of key markers of liver fibrosis in a well-established model of that disease. We also entered into a formal collaboration arrangement with the Garvan Institute in Sydney. And the reason we entered into this collaboration is because there is a research group in particular there, a group led by a chap called Paul Timpson, who are world experts in FAC and its biology. And so we're working with them to expand and make sure we get the most out of our FAC inhibitors and the therapeutic potential that they offer. We've already shown in that collaboration that AMP945 improves the efficacy of standards of care in pancreatic cancer, and that's one of the bases for initiating our clinical studies in pancreatic cancer. That group also had a really nice paper published in a leading peer-reviewed journal called Science Advances earlier this year. And they showed in that paper that if you prime dose with a FAC inhibitor together with the standard of care, gemcitabine and Abraxane, then you increase survival in a well-established model of pancreatic cancer and you reduce metastasis. And that is entirely consistent with our understanding of the role that FAC plays in the development of metastasis. All the while, another group that we don't yet have any collaborative ties to also showed that FAC inhibition synergizes with Abraxane in another model of pancreatic cancer. So there's a convergence here of understanding that underpins our clinical studies that says that if you combining a FAC inhibitor with an Abraxane-based chemotherapy is a rational thing to test in the clinic. It's been confirmed by more than one research group, and it's been published and independently peer-reviewed in 2 leading journals. And indeed, when we tested AMP945 in a pancreatic cancer model in Paul Timpson's lab, we showed that AMP945, when added to gemcitabine and Abraxane, which is the dark green curve on the right here, improves survival in mice in this very aggressive form of pancreatic cancer in this model. So this is one of the key pieces of data that tells us that, that AMP945 in combination with gemcitabine and Abraxane deserve to be tested in the clinic. So to summarise, over the last 18 months, Amplia has progressed from being a preclinical stage company to being a company on the brink of phase 2 in no less than 2 phase 2 clinical studies. And in 2022, it's our intent to continue to build on our track record for delivery against the goals that we set for ourselves. We think that the key drivers in value for the company will be initiation of these 2 clinical trials and reporting our early results, as well as progression of AMP886 into new therapeutic opportunities. The phase 2 pancreatic cancer trial we intend to initiate soon is supported by preclinical and clinical data sets. The clinical trial is fully designed and scoped out and is now fully funded. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to reporting back early in the new year on our progress.